Act up. In closets are men that died of AIDS still, dressed in all black homage to omen. Cancers blistered and burst, I am death's meal. Profound legacy must act up foaming. Protest the budget gutted by Big Red. Head of state was a trickle-down nut drip. Candied raindrops that shower me in bed make under-pressure diamonds as we slip. Unbreakable, bold, and beautiful suns. You have made it home to conquer the worm. Romantic calls happened here on the run. A ribbon in sky, we are placed in urn. You needed me because for you I will gather flowers, ornate ones, for the thrill.
I remember the panic around AIDS transmission, had many believing all homosexuals were deadly weapons, carriers of the virus. They wanted to quarantine us and have us tattooed. Remember?
So let's go into it. Do you mind telling that story of the conference?
No, yeah. So I was at a conference maybe like 4 or 5 years ago. And it was an HIV conference and I met Ted there. And it was going really well. There's always a moment, there's 2 moments in a conference for me where I feel very like at home and at peace and like, yes, we're all on the same page. Like, this is wonderful. This is where I need to be. And then gradually, that usually happens at the beginning. And then gradually that gets like eroded away and like chipped at. And it's like, oh, wait, I don't feel comfortable. I don't feel welcome. I don't like this at all. I want to go home. I want to read the 5 books I brought, all those things. And there was an incident, and I was talking to the like one of the higher ups at the conference, and we were talking about the intersection of disability and HIV and diagnosis and disclosure, all these things. And I have cerebral palsy, and they asked me like point blank, like, would you rather be HIV positive or would you rather have cerebral palsy? And without missing a beat, I said, oh, HIV, like 100%, like every day of the week. And they were stunned, floored. And I was just like, no, it has tons more cultural cachet. It has a lineage. It's manageable, you know, all of the things that we know now. And yeah, storied past. And it's not as ridiculed in the same way or thought of in the same way, or yeah, it's, I don't know. And it was just so interesting to me that the person that I was talking with was so stunned, because to me, and again with the like along the lines of disclosure and what have you, I feel as someone with a disability that I have to disclose so much so soon in so many situations, that to not have that burden of disclosure for at least one thing would be a true gift, a true treat. And so that's why it was so easy and quick for me to say, yes, of course, I would love to only have one thing. I'm constantly like saying, like, if I have to have a third thing as I get older, like, no, thank you. So, but I mean, it's all about like the integration of the identity. I feel like is a big thing for me, because I, through my diagnosis, because I had let myself get so sick and so ill, I had to start using a mobility device, a walker, and I still use that to this day. So it is sort of like, you know, this is what it is. I'm not gonna make you feel comfortable just so I can go to the store or what have you, or, you know, live my life, for lack of a better term. And I do think ultimately, becoming positive made me a fuller and more complete person, and just sort of stopped me from like messing around or like being inauthentic or ungenuine and sort of hiding. So I think it's really interesting because there are so many conversations about disclosure and criminalization, that through my diagnosis, I sort of like chose not to hide. And I know that that's a privilege and a luxury, for where I am in life and all these things, but it's really interesting to me, to think about it in that way. And yeah, I mean, that doesn't happen all the time, but if I really sit down and take a moment, that's what comes up for me.
Yeah, because I mean, one of the things that we were talking about earlier was about just how stigma has changed around HIV, still exists, but looks really different. But how there's a reality of living with HIV now for me that is about a choice of how visible I want to be with it, which is, I think, where, for me, that's where my activism sits, which then is really about a choice. The urgency is, for me, in my body, the urgency is different in that way. And so activism in my life, in that sense, has always been kind of around a more delicate, personal, like one-on-one almost approach to being a person, and a lot of people in my life, a person who is openly willing and comfortable to talk about it and is out, and people in my life know that I'm positive, but that feels like the luxury of that today is it feels like a choice to me.
I have a question along that line, because this has happened to me, and I always have struggle with it. When you do openly talk about being positive and your story, do people who don't know, or like, are people surprised or say like, oh my God, I would have never known, or you look so good? That always happens to me if I openly disclose, like on social media or what have you. It's like I'll get some of those and it's just like, all right, okay. Like it's so disheartening, because it comes from people that I wouldn't expect to have that be the focus, or like for that to be what they take away. That like, oh, like I would have never known, like you look so good, like yes, go off, queen. It's like, no, thank you. Like that's not why we're here. Like, and yeah, I don't know if that's common. I don't know.
I mean, the answer to that is yes, for sure, that happens. I also think that's where, like what becomes visible at that point is the disclosure. And I think what becomes more kind of apparent, or like the talking piece in that sense, is then suddenly I think both parties are sort of sit with this question of like, did I need to know that? Or did I need to share? I mean, for me, I don't question like, oh, did I need to share that with this person? But there's this realization whether this person knows very much about what it's like to live with HIV today or not. I think there still exists the disclosure becomes the act. That's what becomes visible. Which I think, I mean, I think I shared this in the meeting we were having when we were watching Black Is, Black Ain't. But I was much more vocally out about my status before I went on treatment. because I was living in France at the time, and France had this public health policy that they weren't necessarily treating immediately upon diagnosis. And so I lived for 2 years without treatment. And during that time, I had this experience that I was just like I didn't feel close to death, but I felt very close to like my mortal self. And it felt urgent to me at that point to talk about it and to share with people. And like my activism felt like very on the surface, you know? And when I went on treatment and became undetectable within 3 months, it was like, the need for that disclosure changed. And I realized that it could be invisible and that I could live the rest of my life without telling anybody about it.
Yeah.
And nobody would know, and what would that mean? And so I always, after that, disclosure was negotiated more around, I think, immediately when I was diagnosed, I had this, it was striking to me how clear it was to me that in becoming positive, I had also like inherited a politics and the entire legacy and history of HIV and AIDS, and the activism around that, the traumatic political history of it that continues, and the continued stigma. You know, I think in disclosing, we always risk experiencing stigma. I mean, disclosure is it's a risk. I mean, I think it's courageous, but it's also very vulnerable. And that's what I mean. It's like we sit with that in our blood. If I disclose, I carry with me in that disclosure like the historical stigma of HIV and AIDS.
Right, and I feel like if like the burden to disclosure, what have you, is like it's a question of like self-stigmatization or disclosure and like freedom and like being unburdened, you know, comes up a lot for me.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to share?
I mean, I feel like I loaded up right up front and just kept going. So I'm sorry if I stepped over.
No.
I don't know if there's anything else to say. I mean, this is like.
Do you want to say anything about the doulas? Sorry. Keep going.
Oh no, I mean, I guess okay, so this is like a unformed, like, please be gentle thought. But like, because I'm always stuck on like, because people feel, and I tried to say this in an email, but I was writing it, you know, on my phone. People feel like uninformed and like like don't know like how, because in terms of like how I like was slow to get diagnosed and like, you know, going until the wheels fell off. Like I was so unsure of what would happen once I received what I knew would be a positive result or positive diagnosis. And so I just explained it away, all the symptoms away and everything to my detriment, and talking about being close to my own mortality. Like I, you know, got a blood transfusion for 3 months, like after my diagnosis and stuff, and was like literally in the hospital. And like, and so that's like, those are the moments that I think about where it's just like, I can't like this, like I can't live that, like this is not my life, you know, like I don't, you know, I have to, like there's something else than this. But what I mean really is like how there's like I don't know how to say this without seeming like anti-sex positive and stuff, but like just like the underground networks of information that a lot of people like operate in, that then like aren't necessarily true and like could easily be confirmed by like public health clinics and stuff, and like just like easily accessible information, and like being in the right spaces, and like allowing people to have access to healthcare and information. So it's not a stigmatizing experience to like go to like a health clinic, and like, I don't know. That's just a sticking point for me, because it is sort of just now that I am, because I do a lot of volunteer work with my AIDS service organization, and it is just like I feel so foolish for thinking that like they were just gonna like tell me that I was HIV positive and like leave me to my to live the rest of my life like not on treatment, and like just like, okay, well, thank you, bye, like have a good day. Like that wasn't going to happen. But again, culturally and pop culture images would lead me to believe that people living with HIV are just like left to come what may, or like to left to die, for lack of a better term. And so that's like, I don't know, that was a sticking point for me, and that I still think about, and just like how wrong I was, and how I don't want that to be the image for younger people and future generations. And I don't think it will be, but it's an interesting moment to have been growing up in like the 1986 and beyond type of era, but to still have all of those images and documents.
Yeah, I mean, I think, what are we, three years difference in age? We both were born in the early mid 80s. I think our entire sexuality was determined by those images, and we grew up and came of age and of sexuality amidst those images, and amidst this lineage of stigmatization that that creates the exact situations that you are talking about, that happened, like you said, back in 2015 when you were diagnosed. I mean, that's still very recent.
I mean, it didn't win in that a lot of people died. But I mean, that's a very short period of time. The face of AIDS has changed remarkably in America, and it's because of what ACT UP did. It just transformed the meaning of AIDS, which transformed the money behind AIDS, That's winning. It won. And it did it because there was resources behind a set of ideas that were principled. Many other movements have principled ideas behind them. So the ideas were not more principled.
But has this changed the way that you think about political strategy? This realization that there must be some place of access or resource?
Look, think about it. I mean, I think queer activism, the stepchild, the sister, I don't know, the brother of AIDS activism, also has a lot of the same kind of power without the principles. So there's a lesson to be learned there as well.
Which is?
Well, I mean, somehow, I don't have any control. If power and principle line up, things can change in a way that matters.
No, I know what it is. I mean, it's the post-epidemic thing. An epidemic that doesn't just end. And then we go back to the commercial of, toothpaste and European cars. That doesn't happen. And for me, the crystal meth epidemic, or all this stuff that it happens, with one of my doctors, got involved in drugs, and his career and life, is ruined. It's like that, there was no way to transition from total crisis and abnormal way of living into something that can be integrated with the daunting loss.
Well, let me ask you this as a clinician. There's this kind of rhetoric or ideology in American culture about moving on. You should move on, move on. But something that's so huge like this, you can't move on. So if the only option you're being offered is to move on, and that option is impossible, what happens to people?
People basically stay in crisis, but in a different form of crisis. In this case was the emotional crisis. In this case is the post endurance trauma crisis, not necessarily the soldier that comes from Iraq, type of PTSD, classical things. Now, we don't know these things. I don't know if when the Black Plague ended in the Middle Ages, people really learned that they needed to do something about the aftermath. I'm sure that they started going to church and trying to rebuild their lives and going back to normality, and it was not after a while that they realized that some of them are not making it, that they are all messed up in their heads. We didn't know this. I don't place blame. I hope that we look at this and begin to at least try to understand it, by posing the questions like the ones that you are posing. Because it was certainly we were looking in a different direction.
Because now that we have viral load suppression, our generation of people who have suffered the deaths of everyone around them, who've had their own personal health crises endlessly, who've gone through all the terrible drugs, that's like a lost generation, because what the younger people are coming up, they get infected and they go on the meds, and they don't have any of those experiences. And it's becoming an even more unknown, rarefied, and isolated experience.
It is. It is. I don't know if you've heard of Judith Rapkin at the Psychiatric Institute. She's documented some of these. But she also kind of looks at it from the effect of not PTSD, but kind of endurance trauma type of psychological post-danger effect. And she's doing this study on what is the difference in how you have metabolized or processed this experience post-epidemic, from 96 to today. And if there is a difference between those who were involved heavily in activism like that or people who were not involved in activism. My theory or my sense is that the people that got involved in activism like me are much more aware what was happening. The ones that were not involved in activism, they don't know why their lives just do not make any sense. And their relationships don't make sense, and they are becoming more and more kind of alienated. I see some of that in the patients, the HIV middle-aged patients that we treat in the clinic where I work. It seems that they remain alive, not to be able to to connect the dots forever.
So David, in Cesar Carrasco's interview, he refers to trauma as the post-epidemic thing, arguing that the emotional crisis is what lingers for long-term survivors of AIDS in the era of life-sustaining medical treatment. Yet, how might we think of trauma in the context of folks who acquired HIV within the time frame of the post-epidemic? That is roughly in the years since 1996.
I have two minds about this question. First of all, I think it's really important to acknowledge that HIV/AIDS is very different now than what it was during the crisis years. And culturally, we're really saturated with images of AIDS as devastating, as linked to death and dying. So it's really important that we have representations of what it's like to be HIV positive now, which is, just living life, just instead of death and dying, just life and living. So sort of a more prosaic, mundane, everyday representation of HIV/AIDS to really counter the narratives that, it's something that causes such mass destruction. And it's almost unfortunate that the representation of AIDS we do get today are retrospective ones that, yes, it's important for historical memory, but it's also recasting AIDS in a representational mode of perpetual trauma, grief, and death. But I also acknowledge is I'm a therapist and many of my clients are living with HIV. And actually I was thinking about it, all of them have seroconverted since 2000. And, they have, and also me being HIV positive, and we all have different experiences what that is. And there is still some trauma, and that might not be because of the physical consequences or the disease of AIDS itself, but just the strain of living under the stigma of HIV. So even though we've come so far biomedically, sociologically, in terms of stigma, we haven't come so far. And there's a lot of emotional fallout that comes with an HIV diagnosis. And this is also even true for some HIV negative folks who came of age in the era of AIDS, whose sexuality is linked with disease and death, and just it takes a toll. So I think, as doulas, we like to hold space and create discussions for what these things mean. And I just think it's important to think about trauma as something that has evolved in a positive way, but is also still recurring for folks, even folks who circumverted after the invention of medical treatment.
Great, thanks for your answer.
Thank you for your question.
My pleasure.
Okay, was that okay?
Yeah, it was good.
Was it good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was good. Now you're going to ask me a question.
Yes. All right, so now I'm going to ask Alex a question. In your interview from approximately 15 years ago, you posit that the closet isn't as central to an understanding of queer identity as it once had been. Moreover, you affiliate that shift to a sort of involuntary decloseting caused by AIDS. Yet, what role do you see the closet playing now, if any, in the context of queer identity and HIV/AIDS?
So thanks for the question. And I do think it's very eerie to see myself in the representation from 15 years ago and to have tracked forward, continue to be an AIDS activist and seeing AIDS change in the way that it has, in many of the ways which are affirmative that you spoke about, and then sort of thinking about what lingers, what hasn't changed. It is my opinion that the function of the closet is no longer a tenable way to think about gay experience or queer experience in the United States, at least, although it is in other places. And therefore, in the ways that homosexuality, especially gay male homosexuality, has been woven into our understanding and history of AIDS, the closet does not function in relationship to AIDS in the contemporary moment. And I was already saying that 15 years ago. So I sort of want to double down on that. And then I want to make a pivot. And by doubling down on that, I want to say that I think it's almost impossible for people who weren't growing up and becoming teenagers, sexual adults, sexual children, whatever, when the closet was functioning at its most repressive, to understand what that's like. And it was so formative to everybody, whether you were gay or straight or bi or whatever you were. It was such a formative structure, and it produced such strange behaviors. And for everybody, parents of gay children, people at work, relationships. It's not like sex becomes easier or less confusing without the closet, but it's just this kind of whole regime of lies and silences and subterfuge and shifting explanations of yourself with others that's really kind of just gone. So of course there's like a person or people who are in the closet for whatever reasons there are, but it's not a normative structure that's sort of laid on top of everybody's sexuality. And it was zany. It was just so strange and so violent and so harmful to everybody. And so I just don't think that functions. But what does function is stigma, which is an answer in when you answered my question about trauma. And stigma and the closet are not the same thing, but they're kindred. They're in adjacent spaces in the harm that happens to human beings when they're asked to not account publicly or interpersonally for their own reality and their own lived experience. And so it is perplexing to me, although I think a lot about it, why stigma around HIV continues, but it's probably because it was dirtied in its origins or in our understanding of its origins. And what has been particularly interesting and confusing and upsetting to me as an AIDS activist for my whole adult life is that there's now a similar kind of stigma attached to COVID, even though COVID doesn't have anything like the same origin stories. And so it's interesting to think about how stigma attaches itself to some diseases and not others, to some viruses and not others, in ways that are nonsensical, that have nothing to do with transmission, risk, really, and the profound hurt and disequilibrium that are produced in the face of stigma for people. And so activism around HIV and COVID, for me, has always been about facing stigma and continues to be.
Like convulsing practically in the interview, and after a long time told me that, and it was very difficult to get the story out, that his lover had died of AIDS. They had been, I forget how many years, but they lived together years and years, actually in the Douglas projects up on like 100th Street. The larger issue remained that there was no way for same-sex couples to add somebody to the lease, not to mention the stigma, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I went to ACT UP for the first time, because I had certainly read in the papers about the demonstrations, and I thought it was great. And so I found out where the meetings were and went down to the center and basically went on the floor and told what had happened. And that was, and basically asked people to do something, and we did a demonstration. But it was at that meeting where I was sitting, waiting to go up, where I heard people talking about the CDC definition of AIDS. And I heard like the Women's Caucus or whatever it's called. And I, of course, was seeing this problem. Like what I saw were all these women who couldn't qualify for benefits because it said HIV positive, not AIDS. And then they were like dying before they qualified. And I didn't know what was going on. I was trying to figure it out. And then, so I go to ACT UP, and these women are like, oh, the CDC definition of AIDS excludes women.
The first thing you do is figure out where the exits and entrances are. And I just systematically went from door to door, from ballroom to ballroom, to see if there was any other way of getting into the main ballroom. And there wasn't. I didn't find any place. And I just, for some reason, I went up an escalator to like a mezzanine level. And then I went down. And for some reason, the down escalator put me more or less in front of and on the other side of the kitchen. And there was nobody guarding the entrance to the kitchen. They were all on the other side of the kitchen, making sure nobody else got into the ballroom. So I was able to just go through the kitchen and into the ballroom. And I met Ellen Bay, and there was a lesbian Avenger whose name I can't remember. And as far as we all knew, we were the only activists who'd gotten inside the ballroom. And the feeling of just exhilaration and responsibility, what do we do now that we're here? And I'd never taken a bust. And I didn't want to take a bust. I don't think Ellen was particularly anxious to either. I think the lesbian Avenger would have. But for some reason, we chose to work by consensus. And there was one opportunity where she probably could have grabbed a microphone and shouted something in the microphone, but because we were sort of working in tandem, we didn't quite do that. But Pataki did come through. We did get close enough to him. Ellen actually shook his hand and asked him, what's he going to do about AIDS? He said, oh, we'll take care of that. We'll take care of that. And he kept walking. And then we started shouting. We started shouting, what about AIDS? As loudly. And you would be surprised at how muffled a big ballroom like that with people, all over the place can make, even shouting at your full strength. And I don't think we carried more than a couple of people away, but it was enough to get the security guards after us, and they were asking to see our credentials and invitations, stuff like. We just started walking to the exits, and we just kept walking. And one of the beautiful things about demonstrations in New York is that no sooner do you hit the sidewalk than basically you're part of the crowd. And basically that's what happened. But it gave us something to talk about afterward, and it made us feel good.
Okay.
Hi, C.
Hi, Jenny.
I'm Jennie Brier, and I'll let C introduce themselves. And I'm a member of What Would an HIV Doula Do? And C and I are going to have a conversation about the ACT UP oral history pieces that we watched in relationship to this project. It is July 7th, 2021. Oof, it's hot. I'm in Chicago and C is in New York. C, do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Yeah, I'm C, Constantine Jones, and I'm a artist, poet, educator, living in Brooklyn. Been living with HIV since 2017. And I just turned 29 this year, so you can do that math.
Yeah, I'm a historian, and I've been writing about the history of HIV for a long time. And I've been working for a while now on a living women's history of HIV. And C and I met through doulas, and since they're a poet and I'm a historian, we have different and really beautiful relationships to past, present, and future. And I'm really inspired by C's work in poetic form, and how it pushes me to think about time in different ways. So.
Big ditto.
So we're gonna try this out. C, you watched the video that that Devon put together that has the different pieces. Are there some that you want to reflect on together right now?
Yeah. So for me, there was a moment that I felt was really, all of it was very important and hit me, but there was a moment where Ron Medley was talking about sort of trying to go from like ballroom to ballroom, like convention center, important people in a ballroom type situations, and doing like public disturbance and doing that work. And there were two words that he used about just like that experience, which really stuck out to me, which were exhilaration and responsibility. And like how those two things like were in him at the same time. And I don't know, that really struck me, maybe just because words strike me, but also just thinking about exhilaration and responsibility, like as physical feelings, like how do those live in you? Because exhilaration could be like activation of joy and excitement, but it could also be activation of like anxiety and like adrenaline and like the sensation of like, oh shit, there are things at stake for me and my body right now in this moment doing this thing. Mm-hmm. And then responsibility, I guess I appreciated that he used that word instead of its neighbor obligation, because I feel like obligation is more like from the out coming in. Whereas responsibility to me feels more like a recognition of the out, but then it's like I'm putting my in to the out voluntarily, I guess.
The other word I thought about was accountability, which would be a word we might use more in the current.
Yeah, because then it's not like there's a guilt or there's like an answerable person who you haven't done a job for. It's just like, no, I recognize that there's something that needs to be done and I have the capacity to do it, and I feel that I want to and ought to. And like, I don't know, I think that thinking about responsibility in terms of specifically like AIDS activism, past, present, and future, it's like, I think it's all rooted in that sense of like having something at stake. Because like, if you don't give a shit about something, like you're just not going to do anything about it. You're just not, you're going to sit it out. So like, if you are demonstrating, you know, in support of all of the things that you could be in support of when you do this type of work regarding HIV and AIDS, it's coming from a place of care. And I think it's coming from a place of like stakes, in the same way that anti-AIDS legislation and mindset and like all of that also comes from a place of care, right? Like these people care enough to push back, you know? And so like, if they didn't give a shit and we didn't give a shit, nothing would get done. And so I don't know, that was, like you'd never be so angry if you didn't care so much, I guess.
Right.
So, and that is the feeling.
I liked, yeah. And then when Ron ends the clip with like, what about AIDS? What about AIDS? What about AIDS?
Right.
You know?
And he was saying like, even in a room like this, you know, to the full capacity of your body, we can be screaming, what about AIDS? And like not really make a dent in it.
No.
And like, that's, I mean, on both a metaphorical and like actual level, that's like, that's tough. So I don't know, that was among the many moments, but one that really, really stood out to me. And I know that I'm sure for you also, there were parts of
I mean, there are some really interesting threads through the clips that Devon chose, but for me, sort of connecting what about AIDS, and then Terry McGovern describing her work with women and how she came to understand that the CDC definition needed to include women. And then Carrasco, the clip with Carrasco where they're talking about crisis and what happens when you're in an ongoing crisis and you can't move on. Like all of those things sort of came together to me. I've been thinking a lot about women living with HIV inside their bodies and how absent they still are from every conversation. You know, whether it's just in any account that we have, any historical, contemporary, future account, and you see the way that like women are written out of the history, but I also in that combination, in that sort of thread, how present women are in the clips, but none of them are women living with HIV in their bodies. Those, at least they don't identify that way. So there's still this sense that women provide care, which is important, part of the story, but they also are really important to understanding the history of HIV/AIDS or its present or its future. And so like, what does it mean when a crisis doesn't even hold you in its sights? So it's not just you can't move on, but it's actually that you never got connected to the crisis in the first place. Like you're never in the way the crisis is imagined.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really struck by that here. And then in like, you know, in our ongoing conversations, AIDS is AIDS ain't 40, like where do women living with HIV fit in that story, in those stories? And how do we center them in ways that feel authentic, and also like true? I don't know. There's something about the fact that, you know, many people say like the Change the Definition protest was the most, or campaign was one of the most important things ACT UP New York and ACT UP nationally ever did, and that it changed fundamentally the course of the AIDS pandemic. But it's like, I don't know, it's like it lives in that one moment and it doesn't suffuse the rest of the story. It's like it gets grounded there and then it disappears.
Right. Yeah.
So,
No.
Yeah.
Because I was like astounded, I guess maybe not even a year ago, when I understood that it wasn't just a semantic thing, like including women into the definition of AIDS also like had consequences for the care that they had access to.
Yeah.
But then again, is that like over and done, or is that still a thing?
Right.
And I think that's maybe what you're getting at.
Right. Well, you also see in that moment, in that particular clip, like that there is nothing that biomedical solutions are never sufficient to actually end AIDS. Biomedical solutions are never sufficient. You see in that example, it's about housing. It's about how to deal with being returning citizen from incarceration. It's about kids and foster systems and all sorts of things. But women are really the key to that. And the other thing that happens in that Change the Definition is intravenous drug users are more able to be seen also.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really important moment, but it's not just a moment. It's like it's a huge shift.
Yeah.
And it changes everything at the same time that it gets just remembered as this one discrete thing.
Right.
You know? So I think that for me, as we're sort of thinking about AIDS ain't 40, like that's an important thing to remember too, as part of that.
And how so many of the questions that we seem to be asking with regards to AIDS ain't 40 is like how moments can actually be super expansive and have multiple different components. And it's not just like, bing, that was the moment. It's like the moment is in flux.
Well, and I also think like when I read your poem for the first time, I experienced a really different notion of time than historical time. And I know that there are lots of forms of time. And even doing, you know, the oral histories mark a particular moment in time, like when they were done, as well as what they're remembering, as well as how that in-between time has shaped what they remember and all of that. But I think that is really, for me, like what it means to say AIDS ain't 40 is true in so many different ways that I didn't understand before I read your poem.
El legado de les activistas de ACT UP es que la respuesta intencional, la acción mental, física y espiritual y repleta de revolución es necesaria para nuestra sobrevivencia. El sistema continúa siendo uno de opresión. La transfobia y homofobia, racismo, clasismo, la represión en contra de nuestros, nuestras, nuestres cuerpos, cuerpas, cuerpes, queer, es constante. Lo fue cuando ACT UP nació y esa opresión sigue presente en el aquí en el ahora. Creo que la complacencia del capitalismo con sus paradas y endosos de marcas han servido de pastillas de somnolencia. Si eres gringo o gringa y con dinero, si tienes acceso a medicamentos y a un plan de salud en Estados Unidos, ya las acciones revolucionarias no son de tu agrado, o crees que no son necesarias, que eso de acciones es del pasado. Pero para las comunidades que siguen impactadas por el racismo, la pobreza, el coloniaje, el imperialismo, estas siguen siendo violadas. El capitalismo no quiere que nuestros cuerpos, cuerpas, cuerpes, negros, gordos, gordas, con habilidades especiales, con nuestros superpoderes queer sobrevivan. El reclamo de la hora es uno de solidaridad. Sal de tu comunidad de clase media alta o alta gringa. Únete no a las paradas, sino a las marchas. Pon tu cuerpo en la línea. Te necesitamos, pero no vengas a salvarnos. Céntranos en la lucha por la equidad. The legacy of ACT UP activists is that intentional response, mental, physical, and spiritual action, and full of revolution is necessary for our survival. The system continues to be one of oppression. Transphobia and homophobia, racism, classism, the repression against our bodies, it's constant. It was that oppression present when ACT UP was born, and that oppression is present in the here and now. I think capitalism's complacency with its parades and brand endorsements has served as a pill for sleepiness. If you're a gringo or a gringa in the US and with money, if you have access to medicines and a health plan in the US, if you benefit from white privilege, revolutionary actions perhaps are not of your liking, or you think they are no longer necessary, that they are a necessary response from the past, but not now. But for the communities that continue to be impacted by racism, poverty, colonialism, imperialism, white privilege, we continue to be exploited and violated. Capitalism does not want our black bodies, fat bodies, our queer bodies with special abilities, with superpowers to survive. The claim of now is one of solidarity. Get out of your upper middle class or upper gringo community and complacency. Join not the parades, but the marches. Put your body on the line. We need you. But don't come to save us. Center us as leaders in the fight for equity.